Hello everyone, welcome to the Media Chats. I'm Yawen. Today we'll be discussing this very important meeting that has captured the world's attention, the APEC summit. Let's firstly welcome our three special guests. We have Jason Smith. Jason is the host of the Bridge podcast from the United States. And also we have Maria Sanhueza. Maria is a journalist from Chile, and also she's a commentator. We also have Bo Siwattra. Siwattra is a journalist from Thailand. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meetings, or APEC, are taking place in San Francisco this week. Leaders from 21 member economies, including major players such as China, United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, are gathering to discuss ways to enhance cooperation, trade, and economic growth across the Pacific region. APEC was established in 1989. Initially, it focused on trade and the economy, but nowadays, its scope has expanded to include a broader range of topics. So in this episode, we will delve into shared interests among APEC member economies and also the challenges they encounter. In addition to that, we'll also provide insights into its cooperative outlook. So first of all, Jason, is this a question for you? Could you share with us some background on APEC? I know it's very important for our audience to know the background before we delve into a more in-depth discussions.
Well, economics is complicated, and changing the economics of one country is extremely complicated. So if we're going to enter into new trade arrangements which facilitate trade between nations, which is Economics 101, going to improve the economic standing of all countries, especially developed countries when they enter into trade blocs. If there is a lowering of tariffs and an increase in trade, that increases the wealth of all recipient countries. In less developed countries, this tends to be less true. And so let's just look at the United States, for example, my own country. I'm familiar with the internal politics. If we want to change a single policy in terms of the United States international trade, that requires at least two parts of government to agree on that. So the House and the President, for example, need to pass a law to change that. So obviously they're not going to just do this unilaterally. So what needs to happen first is dialogue and discourse. And APEC is essentially a discourse forum, a forum for discussing economic possibilities. So when these 21 nations get together, they're essentially looking at how can we make it possible for increased trade, for increased logistics, for your nation and my nation to both get what we want and to benefit for both of our people. Because we're not talking about two nations entering into trade, we're talking about 21 nations considering adopting policies which will affect all of them. And once they agree, each of them needs to bring those policies back to their individual governments and go through the necessary steps to make that amenable and acceptable to the people in their nation. So if this is going to move forward and become a kind of trade bloc someday, or facilitate mechanisms for trade in other trade blocs, you need a lot of agreement. And in order to get a lot of agreement, you need a lot of discussion. So meeting regularly and having these kinds of exchanges is going to facilitate future trade opportunities, which will increase the wealth of all of the members of APEC or other related institutions like the RCEP.
APEC, it has 21 member economies and accounting for nearly 40% of the world's population and half of the world's trade and over 60% of the global GDP. So by looking at these figures, how has APEC achieved these remarkable results based on your observation?
So it's not just about the summit itself, it's about the tendencies after the fall down of the Soviet Union, because the whole the epicenter of the economics shifted towards the Pacific. So APEC, it's not that has achieved herself this goal, but it has to do with a worldwide tendency. And this tendency has been a bit disrupted by the major political clashes in the last years. And this is a very important reason why this summit specifically it's so important and there is so much attention around this meeting. Actually, most of the attention goes to the bilateral meeting between President Biden and President Xi, because we know that these are the two major economies that support, the ground for APEC to still promote free trade and the goals that globalization had, which were the context for APEC to achieve all these free trade agreements and these, non-binding but still enforced in each country agreements that APEC did over these 20 years. So we are in a very interesting moment because this situation, this economical situation hasn't changed, but we have lost a lot of the political ground that was supporting this specific economic infrastructure for the world.
So, Bo, do you have anything to add to this?
Thailand maybe is not a major player for the APEC, right? But I want to bring all of you back to in 1992, before the first summit. This is they held the APEC fourth ministerial meeting. It's before the summit in Bangkok, and we also the host for 2 times already. And last year we also the host for the APEC meeting as well.
When we're looking at this rapid economic growth in the Asia-Pacific region, this APAC institution, it operates on consensus and non-binding initiatives in order to promote regional growth and economic development. So how unique is that compared to other, I'll say, existing institutions or trade platforms?
You know, that's difficult to answer because even if you look at some of the most important global liberalization institutions or tools like the WTO, there's conflict all of the time. So what is binding, what is non-binding? And in terms of what we're able to accomplish at APEC, if you can bring people together, they're going to be able to create more wealth. A lot of us here actually, we're just at China International Import Expo, the CIIE in Shanghai. And one of the things that I noticed that I've thought about before, but I really got firsthand experience there, was a lot of people from disparate parts of business were able to come together quickly. It wasn't just about China and what it's going to import from nations and businesses around the world, but these 100 different countries that were represented in different ways that were there, that were present, were talking to each other. And so maybe someone owns a logistics company. If you don't have anything to move around, your company is meaningless. And if another institution is agricultural and produces enormous amount of sorghum, if they don't have a way to move that around or the right customers, they're not going to be able to get their product to market either. It's only by these different pieces coming together that everyone is able to benefit. So even though it's non-binding in APEC, there's a lot of discussions that go on that facilitate trade, which is beneficial to all 21 members. Even nations that are not members of APEC indirectly benefit from the economic growth that comes out of those kinds of discussions and forums.
This year marks the 30th anniversary of the first APAC leaders meeting. And over the past 3 decades, residents across the regions have seen their per capita income rise nearly 4-fold and lifting millions of people out of poverty and creating a growing middle class in the Asia-Pacific region. And I know it sounds like a very big picture, so could you share some specific examples or something that impressed you the most of how your country has benefited from participating in this institution?
The things that APEC is also, as I said, it represents a tendency. In the case of Chile, which is part of APEC, it's a quite of extraordinary case because most of Latin American countries are not part of the institutions. Within this context, Chile achieved a lot of free trade commerce, including China, as an example. And 70% of our whole export goes to APEC countries. So this forum also, as Jason said, allows these countries to be constantly in these debates, in these multilateral meetings, which are about promoting trade. So without Chile being part of APEC, it would have never been able to achieve all these things. So it's not just about the achievements of APEC as a forum itself, but all what happened in between, because it goes at very different dimensions. And you have people from the bureaucracy sector, from the financial sector, which are constantly meeting, and also countries from within APEC having constant bilateral meetings. And in the case of Chile, it has given us a major platform for our companies, for our products, and as I said, now it's about 70% of our whole export within the APEC forum context. We could say that without being part of the forum, we would have never have achieved such numbers. This is very clearly. We have never had these opportunities. But it also goes in different directions. So being part of APEC also implies to be part of other different instances, because we are in good trade relationships with APEC countries as well, because of participating in the forum, exactly, with China, with Japan, also with some other Pacific located countries, obviously, but mostly with economies that can also take in our products. So it was very beneficial until the pandemic and this new Cold War started to, as I say, take out the ground for these bilateral meetings to be very prosperous. So we are a bit in a different situation now, and I think that that's why this forum is so important, and there are so many expectations, because we have seen the economy to stagnate because of a shifted of the understanding of how globalization should work. We are in the so-called decoupling, a new Cold War with countries, especially the US, who were the biggest promoters of this initiative, questioning the common understanding of how economy should work worldwide. And this is especially damaging for smaller countries like Chile, because we don't have much of a say in the geopolitical context. So for us, the first years of APEC, the first 2 decades, were very beneficial. But now with this economic stagnation, as we are exporting countries, we suffer more than larger economies.
I completely agree with everything that was just said, because in the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s, my country, the United States, was very much the champion of liberal trade, very much trying to stand out as a beacon of international trade. And a lot of that was not necessarily always to the benefit of other partners around the world. However, at some point after the turn of the millennium, the United States is increasingly drawing within itself and cutting off a lot of liberal trade. They're sanctioning more countries than ever before, tariffs on more countries than ever before. And I, as an American, I don't think that is in our best interest. For example, just agriculture alone, just to China, the United States sold $37 billion in agricultural goods in 2022. $37 billion for U.S. farmers. Americans care about U.S. farmers, but politicians are so short-sighted in terms of election cycles that they're starting to dismiss international trade, liberalization of trade, when it is clearly benefiting Americans, American companies, American manufacturers, and American farmers. So the way that the United States is kind of turning inward is not just having negative impacts on other countries, but it's having negative impacts on Americans themselves. So I think that the United States needs to return to the place that it was in terms of foreign policy on trade 20 years ago, because it was in a lot healthier place, that it was developing better for countries around the world, but also for the United States of America as well.
We actually will delve into more about the U.S. role and its implication in terms of economic participation in the Asia-Pacific region later on, but let's hold on that thought here. I want to come to you, Bo. I know as a reporter from Thailand, Thailand has been actively participating in APAC as well. So how do you view some concrete benefits that after Thailand participating in this in APAC?
Okay, I can give you like a different angle from both of them. Just like as you mentioned, the last year Thailand was a host, and apart from the beneficial in the long run of the building economic cooperation in the largest framework in the world, throughout the last year, we got many people from the group of 20 members from the APEC economic zone that come to Thailand, and that's all level, from official up to minister, and they all come and spend the money, use the service, and try to help my country to promoting the tourism, buy the souvenir, anything. That means last year, we all benefit for all of them that come to Thailand. And I think this year for the summit, my Thailand team put some project that we call a land bridge project. It's catalyst of the economic growth in Thailand. That is also the same project that when my prime minister was in Beijing and talked to your presidency. This is the all benefit that I saw it from being the good participator in the summit.
Observers noted that over the past 3 decades, led by APAC, the Asia Pacific region, has emerged as a vital hub for global economic growth, and this is mainly attributed to the region's focus on economic development, while avoiding distractions from other topics like regional conflicts in the Middle East, for example. So how has this focus on economic development contributed to the rapid economic growth in the region?
Well, that's very complicated. I think around the world, obviously, conflict is not in the majority of parties' interest. In fact, I read some analysis recently that suggests that it's not in anyone's interest, which I'm glad that is increasingly the consensus, because it's devastating to economies. So in terms of how is the Pacific region benefiting from general peace in the region, absolutely. But I think that there are other factors like China's economic miracle. So we're talking about how did nations benefit? And you asked us specifically about our own country. Well, I'm here in China, and during the time that I was in here, I got to live in China when absolute poverty was eliminated as something that China took upon itself for many decades. And in 2020, there were no people in China living below that marker. And so I think it's not just about not having conflict, but it's about addressing basic needs for people. Because if more nations around the world could take up that kind of gauntlet, then we could see increases in economic activity. Because China wasn't just giving them handouts inside of itself. It was going into regions and incorporating them into the national economy and the international economy. So you grow a particular product, it was integrating that community, which was previously impoverished, into the national economy by helping them find the best place for their products. If you look at APEC, right? That's essentially what we're doing, but we're doing it on an international scale. We're taking economies that are producing products that are desirable to other economies around the world and facilitating their export. So that is creating wealth in the same way that China was able to eliminate poverty within its own borders.
So there is very little incentive for small countries or underdeveloping economies to take part on war conflicts. And this has been the tendency since 1989. For instance, Chile has not taken part in a war since about 200 years. And this is reality of most countries. So I think that this APEC is taking place in a very special moment, because as the world has become multipolar, which differs very much from the origin of this forum, there is more and more discontent about global conflict. And in global countries, we see global players involved because, as I said, for most underdeveloping economies, there is no incentive in taking part in these conflicts because it's very damaging. For all the countries which depend on international markets to export their products, which is most of the countries on Earth, especially in the Pacific region, there is no incentive whatsoever for a conflict to take place. And I think that this APEC is putting this on the table. Most of the world want peace for very pragmatic reasons. Also, let's put aside the moral reasons of what we are seeing now in the situation in the Middle East, but for very pragmatic reasons because our economy suffer the most. And this conflict, it's not small in the sense that it's in a region which is very important in terms of the energy resources. And we know that it's going to disrupt even more the markets because the energy crisis never ended, as well as economic crisis. So I'm very looking forward to see how most of the countries are pushing for solutions for this conflict. And I think that this is a major, major shift since the beginning of APEC, because now, as Jason said, we have China as a very important player, and not just China, Russia is also part of this forum. We have other economies which are pretty much for free trade, and their economies depend on the chains of supply, and there is no incentive for them to take part of this conflict. So the United States, it's getting a lot of pressure also for bringing a solution on the table. And this puts more weight on the economy and makes more pressure to shift from political conflicts.
We know this year the U.S. proposed the three priorities at the APEC: interconnection, innovation, and inclusion. In which sectors do you see further potential for cooperation among nations?
Well, one thing that I'm interested in is renewable energy sources, and this is where China shines. So if we're talking about inclusion, well, the most affordable, highest quality solar panels and wind technology comes from China. So nothing would make me happier, and I think this is part of Gavin Newsom's visit to China also, who's actually the former mayor of San Francisco, where APEC is being held this year. As the governor of California, he came over because he wanted to cooperate on energy. And China produces the most solar. It's 80% of all solar technology comes from China. Now, if we can get the United States and other nations on board with importing a lot more Chinese technology, we can protect the environment better together. This is not something any one nation can do. And China has rolled out more renewable energy than any nation in the world. In fact, I think right now, in both solar and in wind, actually, and also in hydropower, China has as much as the rest of the world combined, all three. And China has, 20% of the world's population, so that makes sense. However, because China controls 80% of the market, it also makes sense for other nations, and that could be for APEC, but also nations beyond APEC, to import those technologies and roll them out as quickly as possible. The Wall Street Journal recently said that China created a glut of solar products for the market. I think that is completely upside down. Rather, we should look at it as China has created the conditions to begin abandoning fossil fuel emitting technologies. So if we're talking about APEC, what can we cooperate on? We can look at how we can deploy these technologies now that they are affordable for especially developing nations. If the United States wants to protect its own market, that's the United States' problem. I don't think Gavin Newsom does. I don't think California does. But for developing nations, I'm certain that they would rather skip over having to import coal and gas from other countries and become energy independent. If they have solar, if they have wind, they don't need to import coal. They don't need to import gas. They can just continue to produce their own energy from nature. And I think that a lot of countries around the world are looking at skipping over the fossil fuel emitting part of industrializing and looking at a more environmental way of doing that. And cooperation is necessary in order to facilitate that.
I agree with Jason that this is where the renewable transition, it's where cooperation is most needed. And actually cooperation is needed in all levels because none of the current crises can be solved on a national level. They are all worldwide crises. But where cooperation is more urgent is in the military sector. And now, and without anybody's expectation, we have a second outbreak of a war in the Middle East with a great potential of escalation. And I think that these conversations, these agreements towards the use of artificial intelligence in the military sector and how to avoid casualties, especially in the Taiwan Strait, it's the ground for all the other cooperations to happen. And I think that with all the pressure of most of countries in APEC towards the United States, it's most likely to happen because nobody wants this situation. It's very clear that there is a huge gap between what the NATO-oriented countries were trying to do towards their own population. There is a big sense of criticism within the United States about the support of the US in this, or their participation in this war, and the same happened in Europe. There is a big discontent. There is a lot of pressure which is being exercised from the population towards the governments for stopping this war. And this has also to do with the fact that people can feel how their lives are being impoverished by these two outbreaks and how the chains of supplies are having daily impacts on our life. Because the prices of the energy resources are rising, there are less jobs and so on. So I think that APEC could set up the ground for these conversations to happen and hopefully to have a more stable climate after these bilateral meetings between China and US. I think that this is where we should have our expectations, because without this being achieved, there's little which can be achieved on the other dimensions.
I do notice there was a recent report released by APAC Regional Trends Analysis, and it says that economic growth in the APAC region is showing signs of improvement, with expected growth of 3.3% this year compared to 2.6% last year. However, it also pointed out that the future trade in APAC is clouded by geo-economic fragmentation and the accumulation of trade restrictive measures. So what are your guys' thoughts on the report's trade concerns?
In my country's case, in the United States, I think that is apt. It's a perfect description of the direction that the United States has taken, again, with sanctions and with tariffs. And so I think the United States is also beginning to realize, especially the people, not necessarily some of the politicians, that this is not to the advantage of the United States. So for example, the United States sanctioned some technology companies in China to prevent them from innovating. Actually, it's ironic that they say innovation is one of the pillars that they want to discuss, because then China was able to out-innovate those sanctions, and now we have the new Huawei Mate 60 Pro phone, which I'm going to get, by the way. I haven't gotten one yet. My wife won't let me, but I'm getting one soon. Not just because it's a great phone, and it is, but because I think that this is going to be in a museum someday, as when people really began to realize that China is incredibly capable of innovating. China has more STEM majors than any other major nation. But in terms of the United States, a lot of its trade, I mean, it used to be, until about a year ago, that China was the United States' #1 trading partner. That has shifted to Mexico. But what's really interesting about that is a lot of the goods that China was exporting to the United States are going as unfinished goods into Mexico, where they're becoming finished goods and going to the United States. So if we look at it that way, China is still infinitely important to the United States market. And if we're talking about reaching consumers, so the United States population is about 340 million people. But in terms of, middle-class consumers who are able to just buy luxury goods, we're only talking about 200 million people. But in China, the middle class is actually about 500 million now. So the largest and most important consumer group in the world now is in China. So I think all the APEC countries are looking at Chinese tourists. It's not just US tourists like it was in the 1980s or 90s. They're looking at China. I go to the grocery store now, and I brought my phone to take pictures, and I found about 50 items in Walmart by my house, which is a common grocery store here in China, that are from the United States and Europe. And I went back home and I actually checked where each one of these things is from Listerine to Lay's potato chips. And it's infinitely important for the United States to have excellent trade relations, not just with China, but all of the rest of the world. It's good for Americans. So in terms of the world becoming fragmented, a lot of the fragmenters of the global economic order need to look at their own position and realize that this is not in their own best interest.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was saying. People are realizing that it's not in their interest, and there's this huge gap with the population's interests and what the governments are representing. And unfortunately, the US is leading this tendency. Europe has backed up what they were doing, but the criticism is just too strong. We are seeing a lot of instability, and this is all very damaging for the economy. So I think that APEC will try to come to certain agreements. There is a lot of expectation precisely because of this reason. And this is not just among the APEC countries, but we can see the Middle East, for instance, where the United States lately had achieved to become, the major voice. They don't have the power they had before in other wars that had a very similar dynamic to decide the fate of these countries. A lot of countries are trying to detach from their influence because they see it's damaging for their own economies. So even if they want to enforce this narrative, they don't have the same space they had in the past, because Saudi Arabia now has become very critical, the Arab Emirates, and so on and so forth. So there's a major criticism because of this fragmentation is disrupting the economy. And we have already seen a lot of consequences from this. And if we don't make major shifts now, it's going to be deepen and deepen, and the world is just not prepared for this. We couldn't even discuss the benefits of a different type of economy. Unfortunately, most of the countries are export-oriented, and they cannot shift their economies in 3 or 4 years. So this has meant a lot of poverty. Latin America, for instance, went back 30 years in poverty. So now we are at the level that we were 30 years ago, which is terrible because a lot of people, millions of people have fall under the poverty line, which means they have nothing to eat. This is the kind of poverty that we are talking about. And Europe, incredibly enough, because it's also a very important economic zone, has a similar fate. A lot of people has already fall under the poverty line. They are food insecure and energy insecure. So there is a lot of pressure. And I think that this expectation towards the APEC meetings are fair because there is too much pressure for this bilateral meeting to come out with certain agreements.
What steps might APAC member economies adopt to handle with this kind of situation?
So APEC herself doesn't have the power to make agreements on that regard because we are talking about a political situation. But as this is the first time that President Xi is visiting the United States, I think these conversations about the use of artificial intelligence and the military talks are reestablished. And I think that with that, we have a better ground to all the other economic agreements because we are talking about the epicenter of APEC. If there is no geopolitical security in the South Pacific, there is no point for APEC even to exist. So this is the most urgent thing. And most likely this is going to happen. And in that sense, I think that these expectations are fair. And all the other countries, as I said before, they are making pressure for this also to happen. Because without this, there is no ground for APEC to exist. All this trade goes within the Pacific, specifically within the South Pacific. This is the area where most of the population of APEC countries is, most of the trading is happening, most of the world, and so on and so forth.
So another focus of discussion between China and US at this year's APEC is the regulation of potential risks posed by military use of AI. So how important is it for the world's first and second largest economies to establish guardrails for military AI and to limit the use of AI in autonomous weaponry?
Well, this isn't really my field, but I do read on it some, and my concern is the same as most common people, that AI is an extremely unknown element, and the danger that it poses is greater than most people realize. And it's not just because it might become self-aware. I think that's something people misunderstand. Humans using AI to accomplish unbelievable feats can be very dangerous. I don't want to get too controversial here, but let's say most people who are capable of making certain kinds of devices would not do so. But AI can potentially make it so that anyone can make a very complex weapon. And that is extremely dangerous. And it's not just the military that we need to be concerned about, but AI in terms of the access by the general population can also be potentially extraordinarily dangerous for human civilization.
In this situation, we have already 2 conflicts with the potential of escalation. And we have the most important, which is in the Taiwan Strait. So it's not the use of artificial intelligence. It's very important because it can provoke unforeseen situations. And this can end up in a confrontation. So this is why this talk is so important, in order to avoid a third focus of conflict directly between the 2 major powers. So this is what about. It's not just about what the use of artificial intelligence can mean in terms of the possible risk and so on and so forth, because it's not really tested out, there is no regulation, there is no international law when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence in the military field, but it's more about avoiding a third focus of conflict in the time where this bilateral relationship at the lowest, and the Taiwan Strait is highly militarized.
We know within the APEC member economies, there are big countries and smaller countries, and in terms of size and this economic body, in terms of their GDP volume. So obviously there are economic disparities among countries. So what joint efforts do you think have been pursued or should be in place within the APEC to address economic disparities and facilitate this inclusive growth?
Well, yeah, I don't know if APEC is necessarily the exact right forum to discuss some of the tools that could be deployed, but I think it can be, so we can address it here. Favorable trade status with nations who have less developed economies can be crucial. I mean, China enjoyed a great degree of favorable trade status with the WTO, arguably that had a tremendous effect and amplified China's ability to grow effectively for quite some time. So looking at the development of an economy and giving it special rights and privileges within a trade bloc or within the formulating of economic policies within this forum can potentially help alleviate some of the strain there. However, I think there are other forums like the Belt and Road Initiative that might be better at addressing some of these discrepancies right now.
Yes, I think that Chile is a very good example of that because we were about to be the hosting country of APEC in 2019, where a major uprising took place in the country because of the inequality. This was a major reason. Chile is a very unequal country, and every time an APEC summit was taking place, there are major demonstrations against APEC because people associate free trade with the inequality of the country, which is not one-to-one, and most likely it's not the forum who is going to solve this situation because it has to do with the structural problems in the country. And in that sense, I agree with Jason that other type of forums like One Belt, One Road or the BRI initiative have a much greater potential because it's about investment in the country. It's not just about trading. It's also about many other dimensions of cooperations. But being part of APEC also gives smaller economies, like Chile, we just have 70 million people in the country. It's a very small country in comparison with others, to be on the table and still to enjoy a modest but consistent economic development. And without this capital, no other dimensions can be developed. No, it cannot be investment in infrastructure, in education, in digitalization. So unfortunately, there are not better alternatives at the moment.
China today, as the world's second largest economy, it has constantly played an active role within the APEC platform and also the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. So with APEC and also with the Belt and Road Initiative and other cooperative platforms, how do you view China's role and its efforts within APEC?
I mean, I'm glad you broadened it out to not just within APEC, but all these other tools and instruments as well. Because I think right now, after the Belt and Road Forum here in Beijing about a month ago, I think everyone around the world is hopeful that not China, but the Belt and Road Initiative itself, it has many, many different functions. It's an extremely complicated organization. It cannot be summed up easily, and I read multiple books about it, but logistics, facilitating trade between nations physically, physical trade, but also cooperation to facilitate that trade because you need agreements in order for that trade to take place. And this is something that China has been leading on. Although the Belt and Road Initiative belongs to all of the members, China has been going around the world and offering very low interest loans, sometimes 0% interest, sometimes 2% interest, to build ports, to build airports, to build rail, to outfit trains so that they can move across rail, which is not compatible. For example, if you're going to move from West China's Xinjiang into Kazakhstan, you're immediately going to find that the rail in Kazakhstan is not the same gauge as it is in China. So one of the things that China has done is it has pushed for the technological innovations necessary to make the cars themselves change and be able to manipulate their actual track so that when it moves from one country to another, it can be more rapid and we can have goods moving faster and cheaper and more effectively. And by building ports around the world with what is known as the Maritime Silk Route and the overland routes, we are increasing the amount of physical trade that can accompany the kinds of discourse that is taking place in forums like APEC. And the physical infrastructure is necessary to back up these kinds of agreements that we're coming to in forums like APEC that is taking place now in San Francisco.
So Maria, we talk about China's role in the Asia-Pacific region, and U.S. is also a major player here in the Asia-Pacific. How do you evaluate the U.S. presence in the region, especially at APEC this year? The country is promoting its Indo-Pacific trade deal within the APEC. So what's driving the U.S. to do so, and what's its main purpose to do so?
So there are several points here to mention. First of all, the Indo-Pacific strategy started already with Obama. It's just that the US have not been able to achieve their shift towards the Pacific region because they are still engaged in the Middle East, in the war in Ukraine and other military conflicts around the world. This is something that was unwanted by them because they already set up their geopolitical goals in the region. They foreseen that otherwise they would have not been able to catch up with the influence that China has accumulated towards this year. But most important to mention is their shift from an economic perspective to a military perspective. So the US has made this shift, leaving behind economic goals at a very high cost for the population. Unfortunately, most of European countries, because of the NATO alliance, are also following this lead at a great cost. And as I said before, although Europe has backed up the US in these shifts, most European countries have not able to really make things that improve the situation of the economic recessions because there is a major shift towards military decisions that are not in accordance with economic goals. But there are major regions that disagree with this strategy. As we mentioned and discussed before, Middle East, a lot of Pacific countries, and in the middle of this is also India, which has a very complex relationship with the US, because they need India for re-establish their presence in the Indo-Pacific region. And this also come now with the expectations of NATO to expand in the region, which again means that their presence in the regions is not seen in terms of economic trade, but they also see it very clearly and at its first place as a military presence that they want to reinforce as the situation is becoming more and more unstable in terms of their military power in the region. So the United States has decided that military goals are more important than the economy. So it's not just something seen in terms of economic trade, but also a geopolitical point for them that they want to secure in military terms. And this is very dangerous because it puts all the countries also in this military race. So we have seen that it's not just India, but Australia, Japan, South Korea that are being taken into account for this supposedly NATO expansion. And this means that all the other countries, again, need to put more budget and need to take into account their military forces to counter-arrest. So it set up a very bad dynamic that we have seen in other parts of the world and leaves behind all what these multilateral forums could achieve in terms of multi-economic agreements.
Jason, first of all, what's your response or what's your take on Maria's remarks? And also, how do you view the role that the U.S. economic strategy in the Asia-Pacific region, do you think is playing a role that's promoting economic cooperation or economic competition?
The United States likes to say lately that it is competition. However, and it's definitely not cooperation, unfortunately. I know that's what we're all hoping for, that the Xi-Biden meeting is going to mean that the United States is going to be more amenable to cooperation with not just China, but other nations in the Pacific. Unfortunately, I don't think that a lot of their actions are matching their words. So we have the Wang Yi visit to Washington, D.C., and we have Gavin Newsom's visit. We had Blinken's visit, and Xi and Biden. However, the United States policies have remained the same throughout all of this diplomacy. So we're just seeing right now, at least for the time being, a lot of talk. However, I think Maria is actually, very right about this. There have been unexpected conflicts erupting around the world, which is slowing the U.S. strategy, which began with Obama, exactly right, a pivot to the Pacific, and it's maybe that is one of the contributing factors to the United States' overtures of diplomacy right now, because the United States simply cannot afford another conflict anywhere else. It's already bogged down with the conflicts that have erupted elsewhere. So I know this sounds cold, but I'm hoping that maybe this current environment will lead the United States back to the table, not just diplomatically, but in terms of realpolitik, taking actual actions that'll move it closer economically to other nations. Part of that is in the U.S. interest, and I think because the U.S. has now $1 trillion in interest every year on its existing debt, and a large part of that is military related. We're spending $1 trillion a year maintaining U.S. bases, 851 bases around the world outside of the United States. And it's really unmanageable if the United States economy is not effectively growing, which I think it's expected to grow by 2.3% this year. For a major economy, that's good, but if you look at China, which by purchasing power parity actually has a larger economy than the United States, China's economy is expected to grow by the IMF by 5.4% this year. So the United States, again, like I said earlier in this dialogue, really needs to reprioritize economics over military investments because its current strategies are untenable in the mid and long term.
Bo, as a reporter from Thailand,
Yep.
China-US relationships plays a very important role, especially in terms of economic development for other developing countries.
Right.
How important is it to have a stable China-US relationship?
I think in Thailand, we got like a classic quote that we call like when the powerful disagree, the humble is suffer. It means like the both country, if you fighting, that got an impact not just only in Thailand, they also got impact for all around the world. The thing that I can see from China today, I read the news that they got a good news because they increased the direct flight from Beijing to US. So it's a good news. That means that they want to maybe sit on the table and talk together and want to exchange for the people, exchange for the ideas and to come back. And like Jason said, maybe we are not like a economic competitor. We can be like an economic cooperative, right, in the future. This is what, not just only for Thailand. I think all the countries around the world want to see it. And I think it's the best for the world. I think we got like many mechanisms to do for in this world. Just like a G20, we got ASEAN, we got RCEP, we got a lot of like a project that in the same time. But no one can say that what is the real thing that we can do to make all the economic in the world go together and make it better, like for all the things that people in the world they want. Yeah, this is the thing that I think not just only the Thai people, that for all the people in the world they want it too.
What you just said remind me of this saying, like when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled.
Yeah, that's right, that's right.
Looking forward, what are the prospects for APEC in shaping regional and global economic landscape? And also, how will APEC contribute to regional stability and prosperity?
Well, it's always that increased trade is not just good for right now, but it's actually good for peace. And I think that's something that's coming out of the conversation that everyone wants to see. Everyone around the world wants everyone else to be getting along because this is better for everyone. Conflict is not in anyone's interest except ideologues. So really, if APEC can increase trade, the likelihood of conflict actually decreases. I can't remember which prime minister, but I read a prime minister from Thailand who actually said this in a book about BRI. And that's where I really began to really internalize this idea. And the idea is basically like, if the United States has 13,000 KFCs in China, right? 731 Hilton's by 2027, 6,500 Starbucks, and hopefully 9,000 by 2027. And there's 50 brands at the grocery store that I can find that are from the United States and Walmart, and $37 billion in agricultural goods going to China. I think it's not going to be in U.S. interest to have conflict. And I think business leaders obviously have a heavier say in U.S. economic policy, who's going to be elected, who's going to get campaign contributions, who's doing lobbying. So hopefully these business interests between not just the United States and China, but between all of our nations can reduce the probability of conflict. So it's not just about creating better economic outcomes, which is extremely important because we don't want to see people starving. We don't want to see poverty. And I think everyone around the world, no one wants to see that. No one sane wants to see that. People want to see that absolute poverty is defeated, not just in China, but everywhere in the world. But also ending conflict, maybe by integrating our economies more and more and more through institutions like APEC, we can reduce the probability of there being conflict.
I think that Jason pointed out something very important, because we can see this lack of coordination between two different kind of industries. One, the agro sector, the industrial sector is the same in Europe than the US. They are not interested in conflicts or in the shift that the war is taking now. But you have also these transnational capital, military capitals that are well represented in the US that do not have much of a problem with the end of globalization. And this is a contradiction where most of the population has little say, because the interests of the population are not at the moment represented in the big economies. But we can see this clearly expressed by all these series of demonstrations happening around the world after the war in Middle East broke out, and by a higher sense of criticism in Europe and the US towards the governments. So it's not that nothing can be achieved, and when it comes to APEC, unfortunately, it's not a political forum. But as within the context of APEC, this bilateral meeting, which is so important for this to change, or at least to start to change, to set a ground for the US and China relationships to take over again.
I agree with two of you guys, and then I want to add something like I want this summit to be like the first start for at least the fair competition for all the countries in the world.
Fair competition.
Fair competition, yeah.
Very well said. Well, thank you so much, Jason, Maria, and Bo, for your great insights on this APEC summit. And so that'll be it for this episode of Media Chats.
This is CGTN Radio. Hear the difference.